The town of Redwood Falls, Montana, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was peaceful, quiet, one of those places where crime rarely happened. The biggest scandal in town was usually a teenager caught drinking behind the gas station or an occasional bar fight at O'Malley's. But nothing prepared the town for the murder of Judge Caroline Brooks, a woman respected by all. She was known for her sharp mind, firm but fair rulings, and an unwavering sense of justice. Her death would shake the entire community. Caroline and her husband, Trooper Daniel Brooks, seemed like the perfect couple. Married for 12 years, they lived in a two-story colonial-style house on the outskirts of town. To outsiders, they had everything: successful careers, a beautiful home, and no children to complicate things. But behind closed doors, their marriage was far from perfect. Daniel was a state trooper, well respected in the department, but restless. Over the past year, he had started seeing a younger woman, Mia Langley, a waitress at a bar in the next county over. She was 28, beautiful, and more importantly, easy to impress. Unlike Caroline, who was strong-willed and independent, Mia made Daniel feel like a man again. The problem was money. Caroline had most of it. Her salary as a judge was almost double what Daniel made as a trooper. And Mia? She had expensive tastes, designer bags, fancy hotels, and the dream of moving to California. Daniel knew he could never afford Mia's lifestyle on his salary, but Caroline's $300,000 life insurance policy? That could change everything. Caroline came home late that night. It had been a long day at court, and she was exhausted. Daniel, ever the attentive husband, had prepared dinner: salmon, mashed potatoes, and a glass of wine. It was her favorite. What Caroline didn't know was that Daniel had spent the past 3 months researching undetectable poisons. He settled on ethylene glycol, commonly found in antifreeze. It was slow-acting, tasted sweet, and could be easily masked in food or drink. Caroline took the first sip of her wine, sighed, and smiled at her husband. "This is nice, Danny. It's been a while since we had dinner together." Daniel smiled back, watching as she took another sip. 2 days later, Caroline was in the emergency room. She had woken up with nausea, confusion, and an unbearable headache. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion. But as the day went on, her speech slurred, her vision blurred, and her breathing became labored. By the time she collapsed in her office, her kidneys were already failing. Doctors were baffled. Blood tests showed signs of poisoning, but nothing obvious. Caroline had no known enemies, no history of drug abuse, nothing that explained why a healthy 43-year-old woman was dying. By the evening of November 20th, Judge Caroline Brooks was dead. The news of Caroline's death hit the town hard. The courthouse lowered its flag to half-mast. Her colleagues and friends gathered for a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps. Daniel played the grieving husband perfectly: tears at the funeral, a trembling voice in interviews. He even threw himself into work, taking extra shifts to distract himself from the pain. Within a week, the life insurance payout was processed. Mia was already making plans for their future. It should have been over. But Detective James Calloway had a feeling something wasn't right. Calloway had been a homicide detective for 20 years. He had seen it all: murders disguised as accidents, suicides staged by killers, and people who thought they were too smart to get caught. When he was called in to review Caroline's case, something immediately caught his attention. Why was a healthy woman's death so sudden? The toxicology report showed elevated kidney failure markers, but no trace of common poisons. He had seen this before. It reminded him of a case 5 years ago: a husband who had poisoned his wife with antifreeze. The poison had been metabolized before doctors could detect it. He picked up Caroline's medical file again. There, in the last meal report, he saw it: a glass of wine. It was a hunch, but Calloway knew one thing: sometimes a perfect crime isn't so perfect. Daniel Brooks had no idea that someone was watching him. Calloway requested access to Caroline's financial records, phone logs, and Daniel's movements before her death. He also quietly pulled the life insurance payout documents. And just like that, the cracks began to show. Daniel had searched for poisons that mimic kidney failure 2 months before Caroline died. He had purchased antifreeze from a hardware store 3 weeks before her death. He had been in contact with Mia every single day, even while his wife was dying in the hospital. This wasn't a grieving husband. This was a man with a plan, and Calloway wasn't going to let him get away with it. Detective James Calloway had built his career on gut instincts and hard evidence. The moment he saw Caroline Brooks' medical records, his gut told him something was off. But now he had more than a feeling. He had a lead. He decided to start small. No need to spook Trooper Daniel Brooks just yet. Instead, he called Daniel down to the Redwood Falls Police Department under the pretense of a routine follow-up on Caroline's death. Daniel walked in looking like a man who had already moved on. He had put on a little weight, his tan uniform pressed and neat, and his expression was carefully composed. "Detective Calloway," he greeted, shaking his hand firmly. "I appreciate you looking into this. Anything new?" Calloway motioned to the chair across from him. "Just tying up loose ends. Have a seat." Daniel sat down. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first step toward his downfall. Calloway started easy. "How are you holding up, Daniel?" Daniel sighed. "Trying to take it one day at a time, you know. It still doesn't feel real." Calloway nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Losing a spouse suddenly, it's devastating." He paused, then slid a folder across the table. "I wanted to go over a few things again. Standard procedure." Daniel glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. "Sure." Calloway flipped it open. Inside were Caroline's last known meals, her medical report, and a list of Daniel's recent purchases. He didn't go straight for the kill. Instead, he took a detour. So, about the night of the 17th. "You cooked dinner?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, Caroline worked late, so I made salmon and mashed potatoes. She loved it." Calloway made a note. "And she had wine with it?" Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Yeah, red wine." Calloway leaned back in his chair, studying him. "See, here's something interesting. When Caroline was admitted to the hospital, the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. They suspected poisoning, but the tests came up clean." Daniel forced a frown. "Poison? That's insane." Calloway didn't blink. "Right? But here's the thing. Some poisons don't show up in standard tests, like ethylene glycol. You might know it by another name. Antifreeze." Daniel's face remained neutral, but Calloway caught the way his fingers tightened on the arm of the chair. The conversation lasted another 15 minutes. Calloway didn't push too hard, just enough to plant the seed of doubt in Daniel's mind. Let him wonder how much the cops really knew. After Daniel left, Calloway turned to his partner, Detective Rachel Martinez. She had been listening from behind the two-way mirror. "You see that?" Calloway asked. Martinez nodded. "Oh, yeah. He got real stiff when you mentioned antifreeze." Calloway smirked. "Because he knows exactly what it does." Calloway wasn't the only one digging. Martinez had been working her own angle. Mia Langley, the mistress. Mia worked at a sports bar in the next county. She was young, pretty, and exactly the kind of woman who liked expensive things. Martinez walked in that evening, taking a seat at the bar. She ordered a drink and waited. Sure enough, Mia came out of the back, laughing with a coworker. Martinez waited for the right moment, then flagged her down. "Hey, Mia!" Mia turned, confused. "Yeah?" Martinez flashed her badge. "Detective Rachel Martinez. Can we talk?" Mia's face went pale. Mia cracked faster than expected. At first, she played dumb. "I don't know anything about Caroline's death. I barely even knew her." Martinez leaned in. "But you knew Daniel. Intimately." Mia swallowed. We were just friends." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Friends who texted 600 times a month? Friends who booked a trip to California a week after his wife died?" Mia's mouth opened, then closed. She was in too deep. "Look," Martinez said, lowering her voice, "I'm not after you, but if you lie and I find out later, I will charge you as an accessory to murder." Mia broke. She didn't know everything, but she knew Daniel had been talking about money for months. She admitted that he had been acting weird before Caroline's death, more paranoid, more restless. And the night after Caroline died, he was with her, drinking, celebrating. Martinez smiled. That was enough. Back at the precinct, Calloway and Martinez had everything they needed. Financial records showed Daniel was drowning in debt. His phone logs showed constant communication with Mia before and after Caroline's death. Store receipts confirmed he had purchased antifreeze a few weeks before she died. His Google history, full of searches about poisons and life insurance payouts. Now all they needed was a confession. Calloway leaned back in his chair, watching as Martinez arranged everything in a neat pile. "You ready?" he asked. Martinez smirked. "Let's go get our guy." Detective James Calloway had played this game before. The trick wasn't to rush. It was to let the suspect think he was safe before pulling the rug out from under him. For the past few days, Calloway and his team had been building their case against Trooper Daniel Brooks. They had financial records, text messages, a mistress ready to flip, and an undeniable pattern of deception. Now it was time to make their move, but Calloway wanted to do it right. No unnecessary drama, no chase, no chance for Daniel to run. So they set a trap, and Daniel walked right into it. Daniel got the call while he was finishing a traffic stop on the highway. "Trooper Brooks? Speaking. This is Detective Calloway. We need you to come down to the station. Just a couple more questions about Caroline's case." There was a pause. Calloway could hear the hesitation in Daniel's voice. Sure. When?" Calloway smiled to himself. Hook, line, and sinker. "Right now would be great." Daniel walked into the Redwood Falls Police Department at 3:07 p.m. alone. He wasn't wearing his uniform, just jeans and a leather jacket. Maybe he thought it made him look more casual, less like a suspect. But Calloway saw the nervous flicker in his eyes as he entered the interrogation room. Martinez was already waiting inside, arms crossed. A thick case file sat on the table in front of her. Calloway walked in, shutting the door behind him. "Take a seat, Daniel." Daniel hesitated, then sat down. "What's this about?" Calloway sat across from him, flipping open the file. He let the weight of the silence settle before speaking. "It's about your wife's murder." Daniel's face didn't move, but his hands clenched into fists. "What the hell do you mean, murder?" "The doctors—" "We know what you did, Daniel." Calloway's voice was calm, steady. "We know about the antifreeze, the life insurance, Mia. We know everything." Daniel laughed, but it was forced. "That's crazy. You don't have anything on me." Martinez leaned forward. "Actually, we have a lot. Phone records, search history, bank statements. Oh, and Mia." She talked. That hit Daniel hard. His entire body went stiff. She wouldn't." "She did," Martinez smirked. "And she gave us plenty." Calloway pulled out a sheet of paper. "You searched for undetectable poisons on September 2nd. Bought antifreeze on October 25th. Texted Mia about the life insurance payout 2 days after your wife died. What do you think a jury's going to say about that?" Daniel's face darkened. "I want a lawyer." Calloway sighed. "That's fine, but we're done talking." He nodded to Martinez. A second later, the door burst open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. "Daniel Brooks, you're under arrest for the murder of Caroline Brooks." Daniel's face fell. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he finally realized the perfect crime had just fallen apart. Daniel sat alone in county lockup, staring at the cold concrete walls. His lawyer had already advised him to shut up and wait. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Mia. She betrayed him. She sold him out. And as he sat there, anger growing in his chest, he made a decision. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. Daniel Brooks had spent 1 night in county jail, but it felt like a lifetime. The air was stale, the food was barely edible, and worst of all, he had no control. For years, he had been the one with power. As a state trooper, people feared his authority. Now he was just another criminal in an orange jumpsuit. He needed a way out. So, early that morning, he called his lawyer. "I want to make a deal." Detective Calloway sat across from Daniel in interview room B, a tape recorder running. Daniel's lawyer sat beside him, stone-faced. Calloway leaned forward. "You said you had something to tell us." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah, but I want something in return." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "You're looking at life without parole, Daniel? What exactly do you think you can negotiate?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'll tell you everything. I'll confess to what happened that night, but I want a plea deal. 25 to life, possibility of parole. Calloway glanced at the assistant district attorney who was sitting in the corner. She gave a slight nod. Fine, Calloway said. Start talking. Daniel's eyes flickered to the tape recorder. Then, in a flat, detached voice, he began. I started planning it 6 months before she died, Daniel admitted. Calloway kept his expression neutral, but inside he felt a chill. She had a $300,000 life insurance policy, and I was drowning in debt. Mia and I wanted to start a new life together, but we needed money. So I started looking into poisons, ones that would mimic a natural illness. That's when I found ethylene glycol. Calloway remained silent, letting him continue. On the night of November 17th, I made dinner. I cooked salmon, mashed potatoes, and poured her a glass of red wine. I had already dissolved the antifreeze into it. It's odorless, tasteless. She never even suspected a thing. Daniel's voice grew colder. She drank it. Within an hour, she felt sick. She thought it was just food poisoning. I played the concerned husband. I even suggested she go to bed early. By morning, she was worse. She was vomiting, dizzy, weak. Calloway clenched his fists under the table. And you still didn't call for help? Daniel shook his head. I let it play out. By the time I took her to the hospital, it was too late. For the first time, Calloway saw a flicker of something human in Daniel's eyes. Maybe regret, maybe just fear of consequences. I didn't think they'd figure it out, he admitted. But I underestimated you. Calloway exhaled. They had him. Daniel Brooks had just signed his own fate. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, reporters, and everyday citizens had filled the seats. A state trooper murdering his own wife for money? It was the kind of story the media ate up. Daniel sat at the defense table, looking thinner than before. His once straight posture was slumped. The weight of what he had done was finally sinking in. On the other side of the room sat Caroline's family, her sister, her mother, her friends. Their eyes burned into him with hatred and grief. The prosecution presented its case first. They played Daniel's taped confession for the jury. They showed his Google search history, his receipts, his text messages to Mia. They painted a picture of a selfish, manipulative man who saw his wife as an obstacle. Then came the biggest betrayal of all. Mia Langley had cut a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for immunity, she agreed to testify against Daniel. She took the stand, dressed in a modest blazer, looking nothing like the carefree woman Daniel had once loved. Ms. Langley, the prosecutor began, did Daniel Brooks ever discuss his financial problems with you? Mia swallowed. Yes. And did he ever talk about what he would do if Caroline was out of the picture? A long pause. Then, yes. The courtroom erupted. Daniel's face darkened with rage. Mia looked down, avoiding his glare. He told me that if something happened to Caroline, he would have enough money to take care of both of us. He said, she took a shaky breath. He said she wouldn't be around much longer. Daniel slammed his fist against the table. You lying! Order in the court, the judge barked. The damage was done. Mia had delivered the final blow. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Everyone held their breath as the foreman stood up. In the case of the state of Minnesota versus Daniel Brooks, we find the defendant. A long pause. Guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps filled the room. Daniel stared ahead, expressionless. He had gambled everything and lost. The judge didn't hesitate. Daniel Brooks, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted again, but Daniel barely reacted. His fate was sealed. Detective Calloway stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed around Caroline's family. Martinez joined him, crossing her arms. Another one bites the dust. Calloway nodded. Justice was served. They watched as Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his once confident stride now slow and defeated. You think he ever really loved her? Martinez asked. Calloway sighed. Maybe, but in the end, he loved money more. And with that, they walked away, leaving Daniel Brooks to spend the rest of his life behind bars, a man who had tried to cheat the system, but had only destroyed himself in the process. The walls of Stillwater Correctional Facility were gray, cold, and lifeless. Daniel Brooks had seen his fair share of jail cells during his time as a state trooper, but he had never thought he'd be on this side of the bars. Now he was sentenced to life without parole. The orange jumpsuit felt tight against his skin, and the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. The reality of his situation hit him all at once. He would never be free again. Prison was a different world, and Daniel wasn't in charge anymore. No badge, no authority, no power. He quickly learned the unwritten rules. Don't snitch, don't owe anyone anything, and don't show weakness. His past as a cop made him a target. On his third day, a towering inmate with a shaved head sat across from him in the cafeteria. "You used to be a cop, huh?" the man asked, twirling his plastic fork. Daniel hesitated. "I was." A slow grin spread across the man's face. "Yeah, you ain't anymore. That was the first warning." Daniel tried to keep his head down, but it didn't matter. It started in the prison yard. A shove from behind, then a fist to his ribs. He barely had time to react before he was on the ground, surrounded. Kicks to his stomach, a blow to his jaw, rage and revenge from inmates who had been on the other side of his arrest. By the time the guards broke it up, Daniel could barely stand. As they dragged him to the infirmary, he realized this was his new reality. The nights were worse than the beatings. The dreams haunted him. He would wake up gasping, seeing Caroline's face, her eyes wide with terror. Some nights he swore he could hear her voice whispering, "You did this to yourself." The guilt was eating him alive. For months, he had convinced himself that he was just unlucky, that Calloway and his team had set him up. But the truth was simple. He killed his wife for money, and now he was paying for it. One morning, Daniel was escorted to the prison mailroom. There was a letter waiting for him. He opened it with shaking hands. The first line made his blood run cold. "I should have been the one to poison you first." It was from Caroline's sister, Emily. She went into graphic detail about how she wished she could switch places with her sister for just 1 minute. Just long enough to watch Daniel suffer the way Caroline had. Daniel set the letter down, his fingers trembling. For the first time in months, he felt something close to fear. Not of the other inmates, not of the guards, but of the ghost of the woman he murdered. And for the first time, he wished he could turn back time. But there was no turning back. There was only life in a cell, waiting for the day it would all end. Daniel Brooks had spent 8 months in Stillwater Correctional Facility, and every day felt like a slow death. He had lost weight, his once muscled frame now gaunt and weak. His jaw stayed bruised, a reminder of the last beating he took in the yard. The guards barely looked at him, and the inmates saw him as nothing more than a dead man walking. That was when Carlos Mendez, an old-school cartel enforcer doing life, offered him a way out. "I got a guy," Carlos whispered in the yard, his voice low. "A guard on our payroll. For the right price, he can look the other way." Daniel's heart pounded. Could this be his chance? But there was one problem. He was broke. "How much?" Daniel asked. Carlos grinned, showing his gold tooth. 50 grand. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't have $50,000. But he knew someone who did. Mia Langley. Daniel sat in the prison phone booth, his hands sweating as he dialed the number. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Mia," Daniel inhaled sharply. It had been almost a year since he last spoke to her. "Mia, it's me." A pause, then coldly, "I should hang up." "Wait," Daniel pleaded. "I need your help." Mia laughed bitterly. "You need my help? After everything you put me through?" Daniel clenched the phone tighter. "I can get out of here. I just need $50,000. You're the only one who—" Click. She hung up. Carlos wasn't happy when Daniel told him the money wasn't coming. "You wasted my time, gringo." But Carlos wasn't done with him. "You want to get out?" Carlos leaned in. "Fine, but you owe me when you do." That should have been the first red flag. That night, Carlos laid out the plan. The guard, Officer Jenkins, would leave the service door unlocked. Daniel would slip out during yard time. A getaway car would be waiting outside the east fence. It seemed too easy, and it was. The plan fell apart from the start. Yard time came, and Daniel moved fast. He slipped past the east gate, heart hammering. He was 3 steps from the service door when he saw them. Two correctional officers waiting, guns drawn. It was a setup. On the ground. Now! Daniel's mind raced. Had Carlos sold him out? Or had the guard double-crossed him? It didn't matter. He was tackled before he could take another step. The next thing he knew, he was being dragged back inside, thrown into solitary confinement. 24-hour lockdown, no visitors, no light, no sound. Just him and his thoughts. Carlos Mendez found him in the yard 2 weeks later. "You made me look bad, Brooks," Carlos muttered, rolling his neck. "Now I gotta fix that." Daniel barely had time to react. A shank flashed in the moonlight, and before he could move, it plunged into his side. The pain exploded through his ribs, and he stumbled back, gasping. Carlos grabbed him by the shirt. "Cops don't last long in here, amigo. And snitches? They don't last at all." Daniel collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Carlos walked away like nothing happened. The last thing Daniel saw before the guards rushed in was the prison walls stretching endlessly above him, cold, gray, and eternal. Daniel woke up to beeping monitors and an IV in his arm. His body ached, his vision swam, but he was alive. Barely. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. "You lost a lot of blood. Another inch, and you'd be dead." Daniel turned his head toward the window, staring at the barbed wire outside. Death was coming for him. If not today, then soon. And for the first time, he didn't fight it. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to pay for what he did. Daniel Brooks lay in his hospital bed, his body weak and his mind exhausted. The prison infirmary was nothing like a real hospital. No flowers, no comforting voices, just the stench of antiseptic and the buzz of fluorescent lights. He knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to last much longer. Carlos Mendez had made sure of that. The guards barely watched him now, as if they already knew how this would end. One more stab, one more mistake, and he'd be dead. Part of him wanted it, but another part, the part that had worn a badge, that had once vowed to uphold the law, wanted something else. Justice. Not for himself, but for Caroline. Detective James Calloway sat across from him, the man who had put him behind bars. "You called me," Calloway said, eyeing him carefully. "I wasn't expecting that." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," he croaked. "I have something to say." Calloway leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Daniel took a shaky breath. "I killed her." It was the first time he had said it out loud. Calloway didn't react, not at first. He just let the words settle between them. "You're already in here for life," Calloway said. "Why confess now?" Daniel turned his head toward the small window, the gray sky outside stretching endlessly. "Because it won't bring her back," he said. He was over. For both of them. February 5th, 2025. The last day Daniel knew the moment he stepped back into general population, his time was up. Carlos Mendez was waiting. "You should have stayed quiet," Carlos muttered, his voice low and deadly. Daniel didn't argue. He just stared at the man, feeling strangely at peace. He had nothing left to lose. That night, under the cover of darkness, the final blow came. A shank to the stomach. Silent, precise, final. As Daniel collapsed, he felt the cold floor beneath him, the world tilting sideways. The last thing he saw was the prison ceiling above him, stretching endlessly like the sky. And then, nothing. James Calloway sat in his office, writing his final report on Daniel Brooks. Subject: Case closed. The murder of Judge Caroline Brooks. After a thorough investigation and a direct confession from Daniel Brooks, this case is now officially closed. Brooks was convicted for the premeditated murder of his wife, Judge Caroline Brooks, for a $300,000 life insurance policy. His mistress, Mia Langley, has also been convicted for fraud and conspiracy. On February 5th, 2025, Daniel Brooks was murdered in Stillwater Correctional Facility, likely in retaliation for his cooperation with law enforcement. Justice has been served. Calloway leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Another case solved, another life lost. But Caroline Brooks finally had justice, and that was enough.